Good morning, my name is Stephen Capaldo. It is Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025. Thank you for listening. Today I'm going to discuss something a little different. I'm going to talk a bit about the wars that have been fought by Russia and the US, historically over history. What have the major wars been? So wars, the two countries as having a history of war and different conditions of war, and that's an important point. I'll get into that a little bit. And also the two countries have a tradition of Christianity, and so really my main point is going to be, well, okay, now the two countries have this history of war and they have this history of Christianity. Christianity is supposed to be a faith of peace, and so are these wars going to end? And particularly the one that's going on now, and different wars, the ones that are in the Middle East and coming in the Middle East, and the one in Ukraine. Are they going to end and we have peace, or are we going to have a continuation of war? And there's kind of an irony there that these two countries that have been involved in a lot of wars historically have also claimed to believe in a religion of peace. So I'll just go a little bit through the Russian wars and then through the U.S. wars, and then just go into a conclusion. A big point to make is that the main difference between Russian wars and U.S. wars is that Russia has been invaded a number of times. The U.S. has never been invaded. Usually they're the ones doing the invading. So the conditions of war are somewhat different. I mean, the fact that there is war, there's no doubt about that, but the conditions for fighting it are different. In the case of the Russian wars, sometimes they were being invaded, sometimes there was just kind of mutual antagonism. The U.S., there was this, the Revolution and the Civil War, but then there were also a lot of wars where the U.S. went in and invaded, trying to change the regime or to get some oil or some kind of economic or political advantage in the region, whatever it is. I'm not saying that doesn't happen with the Russians as well, but there is that basic distinction, is that Russia has been invaded and the U.S. has not been invaded. So they're usually doing the invading. So some of the Russian wars would include the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. And so that was an invasion of Russia, and it was a conquest of Russia. Russia was under the Mongols for quite a while after that invasion. There was, at the end of the 15th century, there was a Russo-Swedish war, which was really just, the two countries were just kind of sparring at each other, and the result was just kind of inconclusive. There was another invasion, the French invasion of 1812, the Napoleonic invasion, and there were a lot of losses on both sides. This is what happens. This is sort of the Russian mentality in fighting, is that we're willing to give up a lot, but we can hang in there. We have a lot of people we can sacrifice, but we can hang in there. So there were large losses on both sides of this French invasion, but eventually France retreated, so that would be, sometimes they might call it a Pyrrhic victory, where they had to give up a lot, they lost a lot, but in the end their adversary did retreat. And there were a series of Russo-Turkish wars, so the relations between those two countries have been up and down for centuries, the 16th to the 20th century. And these Russian-Turkish wars were about power. There were power grabs for different parts of Eastern Europe and the Black Sea area. So this is often what wars are about. I mean, they can be about religion, they can be about politics, they can be about land, but there were a series of, let's say, skirmishes, or you could call them wars, between Russia and Turkey from about the 16th to the 20th century. And then you can go into a significant defeat for the Russians, the Russian-Japanese war. So here you've got the Mongols, the Swedes, the French, the Turkish, the Japanese, and then we'll continue with that. But at war with a lot of countries, it was like a surprise attack, and the Russians were very much defeated in the Russo-Japanese wars at the start of the 20th century. And World War II. The Soviet Union fought against the Nazis, and that was maybe the deadliest conflict, maybe the most casualties, in that war, World War II. And then the Soviet Union, Russia became the Soviet Union and extended its control over certain areas that were in the Russian Empire and certain countries in Eastern Europe. And then the Russians tried a big adventure in Afghanistan, and they were there for about 10 years, and they really never won anything. They really lost. They had to withdraw and retreat. And I think this is what the US found out later on when they launched their own forever wars, the permanent wars, as they found, Afghanistan, it's nice to go in and talk about regime change and converting it to this system or that system, but actually the traditions are very old. And the culture is very old, and people don't just give up what they have like that just because you say that you have something better, coming from a foreign place. So so far what we've seen is not a lot of great success in these wars involving Russia. Maybe some inconclusive results, maybe some kind of victory or retreat of the other side, but still great losses were incurred by the Russians. And then the Civil War, and I should have mentioned this before, after the Russian-Japanese Wars, the Civil War was 1917 to 1922, so well before, just as the Soviet Union was being started and well before Afghanistan. This was a period of the people that wanted this new international socialist revolution, which was a workers' revolution, a proletariat revolution, in a country that was basically agrarian, basically rural. But really, a lot of socialist intellectuals wanted this, and they managed to take power, and they managed to get enough reinforcements from other countries to fight and to take control of the country. And the decisive battle there was the Battle of Kronstadt in I guess in 1922 maybe, but that was a very bloody war, and it ended up with a 75-year regime. Socialist communist regime in a country that really was, had an imperial, a czarist tradition and a Christian tradition. I mean, what these socialists brought in was really atheism as a state ideology. So we went through World War II and Afghanistan, and so that brings us to the Chechen Caucasus Wars, which were basically, that was kind of a conflict of religion, Muslims and Christians, but insurgents against the Russian regime. The Soviet Union had fallen already. These Chechen and Caucasus Wars took place in the 1990s over around here. In the 1990s, and then there was one final battle in I think 2009, and it was a very bloody battle with big losses on both sides, and a loss of reputation. Russia really lost a lot of its reputation, as being, peace-loving and wanting to negotiate and, be open-minded with its minorities. And this is a minority issue which is very controversial in Russia, because it appears as though the Russian population, the basic Slavic population, and the Muslims get along well. But then you hear other reports that really the Muslims are making a lot of demands, that Sharia law be recognized, and that they be able to kind of carve out their own country within Russia. So it's not really clear which way that's going. Now that doesn't justify what Israel is doing in Gaza, but this is another example of something where it's not really clear what's happening. Is it that Russia is being open-minded to Islam, or is it just trying to appease them so things will stay not in a state of war, things will stay in a state of uneasy peace, let's put it this way? Not clear. I think you might be able to draw that parallel with the Islamic community in the U.S. I mean, that's kind of another discussion. So this brings us to this most recent war, which has been going on for over 10 years now, the war in Ukraine, and really a proxy war. Once the Ukrainians voted for a candidate that was in favor of constructive relations with Russia and Moscow, well, that candidate had to be removed and someone else put in, and then someone else was put in after that, Zelensky, who came in, and his term has run out, but he's still calling himself president, and who knows? it looks as though Ukraine cannot possibly win the conflict, because the Russian army basically has them cornered, and is really sitting on half of the country. Originally, it was about the Crimea that was taken care of first. It was really within Ukraine. It was about the 4 eastern districts, which were Russian speaking and ethnoculturally Russian. It was about letting them be part of Russia. But now, the longer the conflict goes, the more that the Russian army goes to the west, and it could reach a point where if they take over the center of the country, then in the western part of Ukraine you've got different people, and not just Ukrainians, but different people, and that might disintegrate, and Ukraine might cease to exist. So it looks as though now what will happen is there will be like half a country called Ukraine. It could be that, but it could be eventually that Ukraine will cease to exist. That's one of the possible scenarios. But the war is over in a sense, but it's not legally and officially over. There's no official peace treaty. But Russia has demonstrated its dominance, and you know, the U.S. cannot stop that. The U.S. cannot defeat or overtake Russia. And the whole reason for the conflict, I mean, Ukraine there's some scary people in charge of Ukraine. I mean, nobody wants to talk about that. Some neo-Nazis, and, you know, like half of them are Jewish on top of it. That's another issue. And, you know, the biolabs and things like this. Just a very, you know, just an awful regime. And many people have left. Many people have been killed, and many people have left into Europe, or if they can get overseas, they went overseas. And it's not going to be a good ending for Zelensky, but it's just a question of how long can he hang on. And people in other countries now are saying, well, it's, you know, this is not a war that should be fought, and people in the U.S. are saying this is more and more, this is not a war that should be fought, and yet it continues to kind of smolder and just kind of putter along, you know. There will be a definite conclusion, and it might be the cutting in half of Ukraine or the end of Ukraine, but it may take a while to get to that conclusion. You know, the longer that people stall the inevitable, and they don't recognize the need that there has to be an official peace agreement and has to be enforced somehow. And, you know, Ukraine, if there is still a Ukraine has to not be in NATO or trying to get into NATO. And the parts of the country that were Russian-speaking, ethnocultural Russian, they are part of Russia. They've said they want to be part of Russia. So that's the way it is. I mean, it's just a terrible tragedy, because the Ukrainians and Russians are both Slavic peoples, and they're definitely related. But you know, there was an election there in 2014, and the results of the election were not respected. You know, and this is part of what the U.S. does, is they go into places and they try to overturn elections. You know, that's part of the warmongering, you know, neocon mentality of the people that run the U.S. And the history of Christianity in Russia, it goes back to before 1000 AD, so I think about 988, Christianity became the official state religion, or religion of the Russian Empire, or Russian state. And it has been really, Russia has been an Orthodox Christian nation since 988, with the exception of that period of the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1991, where atheism was the policy of the state. So there's a long tradition of war, and there's you know, a lot of casualties, a lot of invasions, a lot of loss of reputation, etc. Long tradition of war, alongside a long tradition of Christianity. And if you look at the U.S., it's kind of the same thing. I mean, the major U.S. wars, you can start with the American Revolution from like 1774 to 1783, to supposedly free themselves from Great Britain. But, you know, what happened in 1871 basically gave control of the U.S. back to the UK. There was just a reorganization of the financial system. The banks were brought in. You know, that story, which you probably are aware of. And then the War of 1812, to establish the boundary between the U.S. and Canada. It was kind of it was not really there weren't a lot of conclusions to that war. There weren't a lot of concrete results of the war, but it did help establish the boundaries of Canada. And then World War I, World War II, the U.S. Was gaining in power. They were an industrial power now, and so of course they had to get involved in these two wars. And the more you hear about what happened with Pearl Harbor, how that was staged and got the U.S. into that war, the more you realize how these things are scripted. And the people who can call the shots and who have the money, they fund both sides of wars. This is why there are so many wars, and the wars continue, because wars are good for business. And war is really a scam. It's a way for the elite to make money, and sacrifice their own people, right? To go and fight these wars. So you have these two world wars, which the U.S. had to be involved in for their own imperial interests and economic interests. And then after World War II, the U.S. kept getting involved in wars in Korea and then in Vietnam, and I don't know, were those victories? I mean, it seems to me Korea ended up a divided country. There still is no official peace treaty between the two countries. They're kind of an uneasy peace and an uneasy truce, but there's no real peace treaty. And North and South, they're all Korean. I mean, they should be one country. I mean, it's another tragedy, but because of this war that was fought and the U.S. was involved in, you have a perennially and maybe permanently divided country of people that are basically the same people. Families are divided, and the two countries have really developed in very different ways. North Korea, pretty much civilian economy is poor, but very good military and nuclear weapons and all this stuff. South Korea is like a puppet regime of the U.S., but they have more of a kind of consumer society, market economy, just two very different economies, but they should be one country. That now, how do they find a way back to that? And it's because of meddling from foreigners, basically, instead of letting the people locally work out their own problems. Then there was the first Gulf War, in Kuwait and Iraq. The U.S. went in and to secure its oil, and then the whole big thing of 9/11, that's 9/11, there's been a lot of reporting on that, you're aware of that, is that thing was basically staged, and it couldn't have been done the way it was portrayed by the Western media. It was really, there were people who were aware that it was going to happen, and they didn't do anything to stop it, and it was basically portrayed, it was staged, and it opened the door to this so-called war on terror, and all kinds of legislation which was going to further curtail the rights of individuals. So 9/11 was a huge turning point in U.S. history and world history, because it just opened that door to loss of freedom and more censorship and laws that were supposed to protect people but really were leaving them more and more vulnerable. And you see, since 9/11, that was 2001, so we're 24 years later, almost a quarter of a century after that, and you see what kind of deterioration there has been of U.S. society. You see now we're getting this censorship state that's coming on, or at least that's the plan of the people who rule behind the scenes, is they want this kind of censorship, cyber dictatorship to come in, and you have you have this constant staged conflict between Trump and Musk, supposedly, working together but supposedly representing different sides of this. One side showing you what's happening to you if you don't wake up, and the other side saying, well, we need this information control and control of people, and we need Palantir to come in and all this kind of thing. So these are all the consequences of 9/11 and the so-called War on Terror. And the War on Terror, it led to permanent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Saddam Hussein is not a great guy, but what happened to him was that's a result of the U.S. wanting to go in and control land and control money and control oil and control people. It's not a humanitarian regime, the U.S. regime. In Afghanistan, the same thing happened. Someone was put in who was kind of a CIA guy, and there was some attempt, so-called, to reform these countries, but basically countries have their own cultures and traditions, and I think you can make the argument that, waging war to go in and change a country, regime change or systemic change, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. People have their own countries, and people should really take care of their own countries and be friendly with other countries, but not go in and try to go in and invade them and try to change them. And after Iraq and Afghanistan, what other wars have there been? The U.S. has made incursions into Syria and Libya and Yemen and Sudan, South Sudan. And in the Middle East, when is it going to end? Gaza and Iran and now Ukraine, this has been going on for 10 years. So anyway, that kind of paints a picture of the wars that the two countries have participated in under somewhat different conditions. I mean, the U.S. has been largely an aggressor in the wars. Russia has been invaded in a number of wars and has just kind of had mutual antagonism in some skirmishes that resulted in wars. So that's kind of how it is for wars. I explained a little bit about Russian Christianity. U.S. Christianity, since the revolution, there has been a development of Christianity. There's often different ideas about, was the U.S. established as a Christian nation? And some people say it was, and some people say, well, there were Christians at that time, but there were also a lot of people who were just kind of deists who believed that there was a supreme being, and then that's it. People do what they do. But whatever the case may be, since the revolution, there has been a development of the Christian religion throughout the Industrial Revolution and into the 20th century. We've seen the growth of the church, right? At the same time as there's been, never-ending wars. Wars just keep going on and on and on because they're good for the economy. They're good for the people who run the country. But then you kind of console yourself with this idea that, well, people go to church too, but these two things don't really fit. And in the 20th century and into the 21st century, there certainly has been a growth of the evangelical church. And they've really brought discredit to themselves, by supporting Zionist Israel since 1948, supporting the State of Israel, supporting the genocide by the State of Israel in Gaza. So the evangelical church, by supporting Jewish and Israeli Zionists, they have brought discredit to themselves, and you can see that even some of the people on the right. I was just watching something this morning as the fallout of the interview that Tucker Carlson did with Ted Cruz, and Candace Owens was brought into that. That now they are being tarred with this brush of being anti-Semites for simply pointing out the obvious of what the State of Israel is doing, and saying is this really the right way to spend the taxpayers' money. But anyway, the evangelical and more broadly the Protestant church has brought discredit to themselves, and that's why that leaves the door open for a comeback of the Catholic Church and the Jesuits and all this, and who knows if that's going to be any better. But I don't think it will be any better. So anyway, that's kind of a history of war and Christianity in the two countries. So we are now in July 2025, and this is kind of a crossroads for the two countries, and I would only conclude by saying that what's next? Is it going to be war forever, or eventually the peace of God, which passes all understanding? Because really that's the basis of Christianity, is peace, right? It's not waging wars and to keep waging wars and invading countries, or having to fight off people that are invading you, or just going into different places and trying to change them. It's not the Christian faith is a faith of peace. It's built on the peace of God and the love of God. So if you've got this history of war, and the conditions of war in the two countries are different, but still a history of war in the two countries, is that just going to continue, or is there going to be peace? So that's really the challenge of these two countries. It doesn't look very good. I don't really know what's going to happen. Who knows what's going to happen? But that's kind of the contradiction of having these two countries that have waged all these wars, have fought all these wars for different reasons, but somehow are trying to justify because they call themselves Christian countries. And really it's time, I think it's time in God's plan, God's timing, to come clean and say, either we want to go down fighting wars, or we want to come to the table of peace, and we want to live that way. We want to come to God and come to the anointing of Christ, and live that way, which is really the way God has intended us to live. So I'll stop there, and that's my little historical review, and so thank you for listening, and bye for now.